Hey, group leaders, hope you are doing well today. Good to see you, good to get to be with you and carry on these kind of devotional videos that we've been doing every week. We're in Romans chapter 8, as you've probably come to expect, and today we're in verses 12 and 13. So I'd love for you to turn there in your Bible if you're with me there, or you can just kind of listen along. Where Paul writes, "Therefore, brothers and sisters, we have an obligation, but it is not to the flesh to live according to it. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die." We've talked about this, right? None of us are perfect. We can't make it happen on our own. "But if by the Spirit you put to death the misdeeds of the body, you will live." I love this. I talked in a past video about how this whole kind of concept in all of these verses is like a dance. There's parts where God's leading and we've got to follow him, and we don't really control everything, but yet we kind of also still have some influence here on how the dance is going to go and how things are going to look and how it's all going to play out. And it's a rhythm between us and God and our relation with him and how we follow him. And these verses really come into that as well, because he says that we have an obligation to something, but he also says immediately that this obligation isn't really a normal obligation. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever seen this movie, but my brother and I grew up watching a Tim Allen movie called Jungle to Jungle. In this movie, Tim learns that he has a teenage son named Mimi Siku, who was born to like a person who lives out in the jungle, and she does like anthropology work or something. And so now Mimi Siku, all of a sudden at 16, 17, however old he is, comes back to live in New York City. And Tim has to teach this wild jungle child how to live and do life. And it's hilarious, like there's always these different scenes that they end up in. At one point, he says that he was obligated to take Mimi Siku. And the kid doesn't understand. He says, what does that mean? And Tim kind of screws up his words. You ever had a moment where like your words get away from you and you say something that you kind of mean, but you say it a lot harsher than you meant to say? And he says, well, I had to take you because you're my son. And his son says, you didn't just want me to be with you. You were obligated because you were forced into this. It wasn't a choice that you wanted. It's something that you were forced into. That's right. That's the word obligated. That's what that means. And there's this kind of weird sense in Romans 8 here about what this obligation word means, because he immediately says, but it's not to the flesh. Our obligation is not to the law. It's not to the fact that we've got to earn something from God. He says our obligation is actually something much greater. It's an obligation of love, an obligation of seeing what God's already done for me, that now I'm obligated, not out of duty, but out of joy and out of receiving that love from God. I'm obligated to walk away from the life of the flesh. And what he says in verse 13, put to death the misdeeds of the body. He says that God chose you. We talked about that. He chose you. He gave his life for you. And then he gave us these opportunities with the Spirit of the Lord living inside of us to say that everything we do is going to matter into eternity. And that means that we're obligated to go after the sins in our lives, the misdeeds of the body, as he says in verse 13, and to ruthlessly get rid of those if we're going to live by the Spirit, to cut out sin from our lives. Again, not because we're obligated by fear or obligated by duty of I have to do this or else God won't love me, because that's not how it works. Our obligation is a burden of love. That God has chosen to love you so much that I would hope that it motivates and compels you to make some changes in your life, to say, I'm going to go after what God's called me to do, and no matter what the enemy puts in my way, no matter what habits and hang-ups I have from the past, I'm going to go after this obligation. I'm going to go with full force to go after what God has put before me, and I'm going to engage in it, and nothing is going to stop me from getting there. The worst moments of our lives when you fill in the blank, cuss word hits the fan. In those moments, when life is just unraveling, we're still obligated by the Spirit to go after getting rid of the misdeeds of the body and to choose to live by the power of the Spirit that raised Jesus from death, that's inside of you and me. This isn't an obligation of guilt, but one of joy that says, I get to go after what God's called me to. I get to walk into becoming the person that God's created me to be. And I'd encourage you to go after that this week. If there's ways that myself or one of the other pastors here at the church can help you with that, we'd love to. Go after what God's called you to do. Have a great week.